Well, hello, Scott Shaw. Thank you so much for joining me on Culture Chat today.
Good morning, Mimi. It's good to see you.
Yes, I'm very happy to talk to you and very grateful. Our mutual friend Stan Sakai has introduced us virtually.
That's right. Well, Stan's a big shot now. I think he's in Europe right now.
He's all over because I
Yeah,
last
he
time
goes
I
all
touched
over the
base, he
world.
was in Hawaii.
Yeah, well, that's when I met him. He was still living in Hawaii.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he would just come over every year for Comic Con, and then finally he decided to move over here, and history has been made.
Yes, and because I was talking about Comic Con and picking his brain because it is my first year to be in attendance, and he said, "Well, you have to talk to Scott Shaw."
Yeah, Comic Con is something that is near and dear to me. I was one of the kids that helped start it back in actually 1969. They don't quite acknowledge it because we had a little tryout show for a one day very early in 1970, but we were already working on it, a couple of years before that. But
Wow.
yeah, this is going to be the 50th anniversary this year, so it's going to be a big deal. There's going to be, a lot of guests from the past that are those of us that are still around that worked on the show that became professionals, um, and a lot of I think they're going to invite back a lot of people that are still around that have been to the ones in the past.
Yeah, it's definitely a very nostalgic year, being the 50th anniversary, and I'm really grateful that you're taking the time to chat with me about it today. I want to pick your brain a little bit about that time where in 1969 you guys decided, hey, let's all get together and share things about cartooning and comics and all sorts of fun stuff. So how did that kind of come to be?
Well, I'll tell you, in those days. Uh, it was definitely not the age of the geek. We were considered weirdos, and uh, I was very lucky. I grew up in San Diego, and that was just a major aspect to why Comic Con grew so much. Anyway, remind me to mention that later. But um, I had a group of friends in high school who all, like myself, were fans of comics, science fiction, monster movies, all the usual slate of geek stuff. I mean, there wasn't nearly as many outlets or as many variations back then as there are now, but there was still plenty to keep our attention, 24/7. And what's interesting is that among us, I became a professional cartoonist. Greg Bear became an award-winning science fiction author. John Pound became a well-known illustrator and creator of Garbage Pail Kids. And Roger Friedman is an award-winning physicist and author. So, we kind of had geek cred in that it all paid off for us. But at the time, nobody knew that. Anyway, uh, those guys and a few others from high school too, we wound up meeting with a group of people that I had kind of intersected in with when I worked in a bookstore and somebody came in looking for books about old Prince Valiant comic strips. And this was run by a fellow that came in from Detroit named Shel Dorf. And most of the kids with him were not creator aspiring people, but more collectors and comic dealers and that sort of aspect of it. And when we all got together, this fellow Shel Dorf had been one of the fellows that helped create a show back in Detroit, and a fellow that was kind of the mentor to my group of friends from my high school, a guy named Ken Krueger, who had been to the very first science fiction convention in 1939. He kind of had the know-how. This other guy had the contacts. A third guy named Richard Alf had the money. He was a comic dealer that dealt mail order funny books back when they were a fraction of what they're worth now. But still, he was a smart kid, and actually had enough money to loan us to be the seed money to get the thing started. And the three of them were the heads of the convention, and I worked as the publicist. I did the poster art and stuff. All of us, kind of learned how to put a show together by the seat of our pants.
And how was that first Comic Con? Did you have a huge turnout, or was it like really organized and everything went smoothly?
Well, we had a few local cartoonists speak, or a couple of guys came down from Los Angeles, and a couple of San Diego, an editorial cartoonist from San Diego, I remember, spoke. And we had a small room full of, you know, guys. Probably, maybe the oldest was in their 30s, with the exception of one or two dealers, but all selling old comic books. And the interesting thing is that you will definitely be surprised at. There were no women there at all other than moms, because the moms thought, when they heard about, come to the come to the basement of the crummiest hotel in downtown San Diego. And believe me, in those days, downtown San Diego, I mean, it's a Navy town. There are a lot of, strip clubs,
Very dicey.
poker rooms, dirty bookstores. I mean, it was not the kind of place that was, hey kids, hey kids comics. So so I think the moms thought it was a trap by pedophiles or something. I mean, they were
Oh my
like
God.
kind of staked out around the edge, like with their arms crossed, like, yeah, don't try anything. But it all worked out great. There was one young woman there, Jackie Estrada, who is still involved with the convention now. And she's been an editor, and she and her husband, who passed recently, Baton Lash, another San Diego cartoonist. Um, they've been involved with publishing their own comics for years too. So she obviously was another person that wasn't involved with the committee itself,
Hmm.
but she was probably the only notable woman involved with fandom at that time in
Yeah.
San Diego.
Well, I actually have talked to people over the years about comics, and because I have some friends that have pop culture stores, and they also talk about, even the earlier, days as time has gone on. I mean, it wasn't a very female dominated, fandom or also field. And obviously we've seen that grow, but I mean, it was pretty exclusive. I mean, when you started off, each and then you decided you were going to continue on having one each year, was it more like collectors coming together to share, or was it more about trying to get people to kind of educate because you had an interest in being a professional in cartooning? I mean, what was kind of the drive behind, why you guys all wanted to keep getting together?
Well, I think the real key is that fan is short for fanatic. And we really are all obsessive in what we love. And the key was inviting. Sheldorf had a lot of contacts, and uh, one of our very first guests was Jack Kirby, who is now very, very famous and getting more and more famous by the minute due to all the things he created for Marvel and DC Comics, and some of his own creations are going to be
Absolutely.
made into movies too. I mean, stuff that he owned himself, and so his family will be profiting from that tremendously. But he was one of our first guests. And another fellow, Neil Adams, who is a bicoastal cartoonist now. He has offices in New York and in LA. But between the two of them, who were two of the most important guys at the time, and Jack had incredible credibility, and he spread it here, and Neil went back east and told everybody, hey, this worked out great. And on top of that, here I'll talk about San Diego a little bit. Also, none of us thought about it, but now as a professional, it became obvious. All these guys, back then, the comic book industry was mostly around New York City. And cartoonists do not have vacations. I mean, at least in those days, they certainly didn't. They made bad money. They didn't get any kind of a percentage of the sales of the comics. And So their family was more used to seeing the back of their neck than their faces because they were bent over a drawing table all the time. So suddenly, here's an opportunity. You might even get invited, but even if not, you can spend whatever you want to do the vacation and tax deduct it because you're going to a professional comic book convention. So suddenly, you're a hero to your family. So suddenly, we got all kinds of people coming out here from back east, which was, I mean, we're like, hey, we're pretty big shots. It's like, no, you got a really good review by a couple of important cartoonists, and you live in the best vacation place
It's
in America.
sunny.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was just like all the planets had aligned, and that's why I think it off so quickly. And and that was the thing too. I mean, now it's big Hollywood things, and it's all used for marketing. I mean, to a certain degree, it's inevitably that's just the way the whole world is now. It's not Comic Con is somehow been bought off. It's just the way the world is. Comic Con's still a nonprofit organization, and they don't even invite anybody but people who are either writers or artists. All these other people come on the studio's dime. But in the early days, we had movies too, but it was somebody'd have a 16 millimeter print of King Kong, and we'd all nerd out over, and stop the film and look at frames of it, that sort of thing.
I
So,
love
I
it.
mean, film was always part of it. It's just that the application of it's changed.
Absolutely.
And of
Yeah.
course, video games didn't exist yet. We did have in the early ones. I think that's about the time like Dungeons and Dragons. I think that's when in the I never played it, but I think the 70s
Hmm.
was a thing. When you mentioned we were talking about women at conventions, I think that the advent of Star Trek fandom brought a lot of women into
Okay.
Comic Con. A lot of the early Comic Cons were a lot of the organizers that came in were from a group called Star, that was a Star Trek fan club, and we were kind of all those of us that liked Star Trek. We really didn't know what Trekkies are all about because we just kind of took it for granted. We never, my buddies and I liked the show, but we never dressed up like anybody.
Right.
So this was kind of great because not only were people dressing up, but some of them were girls, and that was good.
Yeah, definitely
we,
very
we
it's
we
good to
we
bring in that
we wanted to have
diversity.
the girls around.
Right.
Yeah.
We wanted to see girls in cool outfits and
Well, yeah, and I mean, it wasn't like we were being lecherous, but we were young men. It was like, usually we didn't have much in common with girls. So
of
it was like
course.
suddenly, hey, here are girls that are absolutely willing to talk about the stuff that we like.
I can
Yeah,
imagine
it
the
was it was
excitement
it was
level.
terrific. Yeah. And now it's so funny because back then you would always see like guys dragging their girlfriend around. The girlfriend would look like, why can't I be at the mall? Now you see it the other way around.
Oh.
And I think that's the best flip ever.
For sure. I think also once you started to introduce cosplay and all of the really cool paraphernalia you can, well, I mean, the Comic Cons are kind of like its own mall now, too. You can pretty much shop and get whatever you want there. But
Oh yeah,
speak.
I mean they've got everything from jewelry to imitation weapons to all kinds of stuff. It's
Absolutely.
unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that is one of the things that always interests me because I love seeing everyone dress up and then of course as they have the imitation weapons, that as a martial artist that excites me because I like to see all the cosplayers and that's actually something I've done at cons in the past which is like talk to the cosplayers about how to properly, wield their swords and things like that and just kind of bring that authenticity. But,
That's
because
great.
those are like my pet peeves, right? But it's been so cool to see how much I mean, these cosplayers spend the whole year, building their costumes, and now they look like they could be in a Hollywood film. A lot of these cosplayers, I'm sure early on, it must have been very interesting to see that evolution.
I'm probably the most noted example of de-evolution in cosplay. At the 1972, I'm not making this up, and I'm not going to be too gross about it. It's gross enough. I In 1972, I had an underground comic published about a monster who came out of the sewer, and he was a monster called the Turd. That's as dirty as I'll get. And So I'd been to science fiction conventions, and I was at this big science fiction convention, and that was where cosplay was really big. And people back then, this was like in 72, were already, would spend a whole year making a costume. So I thought, what would be kind of a weird, kind of surreal thing to do? I know, I'll go as my character. And I got somebody, there was a Smart and Final store down the street from where the convention was. I bought 18 pounds of peanut butter and covered myself with peanut butter and went to the convention as a poop man.
Oh my, that's commitment.
and what I and what and what I'd never thought, I mean, I was just trying to do a wacky stunt. I was into Dada and, gonzo journalism. I thought, I'm just going to do something outrageous just to be funny. Well, I'd never thought about the fact that your body heat is going to heat up peanut butter. And so it got all over everything, everybody. And then I go back and I wash it off, and I'm like, and it took forever to get that off.
I was going to ask you
Finally,
if
I'm
you
done with it,
melted because I said San Diego's pretty warm.
Well, fortunately, this was in LA. This wasn't Comic-Con.
Okay.
But
Oh, that's right, right.
but but the maid even, I was so apologetic. She goes, "Oh, don't worry. I've seen a lot worse than that." It's like, wow, I don't even want to know what you've seen. But 2 weeks later, all the plumbing in the hotel exploded because the peanut butter had impacted in the pipes.
Oh my God.
So nowadays, in those conventions, it's still going on. The World Science Fiction Convention. There's a note in the rules, and now it's in many convention rules. I don't know if it's in San Diego's, but it says no edible costumes. In fact, somebody went in cosplay at a convention 2 years ago as me, as the turd, except they made it out of cloth so nothing would get on anything. So I mean, that's how. Not that I'm that proud of, but obviously I'm willing to admit I'm a cartoonist. I'll do anything to be silly. But it's one of those things that now cosplay is kind of eating its own tail. There's enough of a history that now they're doing costumes based on old costumes.
It's all come full circle. I love it. Well, they created rules based on your costume challenges.
that that may be the most notable thing that I'm leaving in my legacy.
I highly doubt that, sir. But, I mean, speaking of, I mean, you pretty much have done everything from animation to directing and writing. And of course, you're a cartoonist, but you've been involved in so many things like Muppet Babies. And I mean, it's like you've kind of got like a renaissance thing going on in the world of comics and animation. And it's been
No, it's
really.
called short attention span. I like working on a lot of different things at one time, and I've if when somebody will come to you and say, "Hey, can you do this?" Of course, when I was young, especially, I'd say, "Yeah, sure," and then I'd find out how to do it. And I was lucky enough that I worked with a lot of old timers, so that's how I think I went to college, but I didn't learn how to draw. I didn't learn how to write. I learned how to have a good time. I went to school and into college in 1968, and we won't talk about it very much past that. But I mean, I'm self-taught, really. But the fact that I was around people that really knew what they were doing in different fields, that's how I've wound up working in so many things. Right now, I'm even been working on a video game, so I'm trying something new there.
Yes, and so because you've worked with so many notable people, I mean, from like Simpsons, I mean, you've done so many things. Who has been some of the favorites that you have worked with, or like you said, that you really got to learn from?
Well, when I worked at Hanna-Barbera, I worked directly with Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera, and when I started there, they assigned me to work with as a partner to Floyd Norman, who is a Disney legend now, and Floyd and I are still very, very close friends. And so that was a big deal to me. I worked with Tex Avery, the creator of Droopy there. Um, I worked under Jim Henson on Muppet Babies, and although we didn't work directly together, I saw how he would take the time to really think things out, and he didn't want to make rash decisions creatively. And I really respected how he worked creatively. It was a big deal.
I imagine. I mean, all of those, have been so impressionable to me growing up. I loved the Muppet Babies and I loved, Flintstones and everything. So it must have
Yeah,
been just an incredible experience.
yeah. And in terms of working, I mean, I've worked with an awful lot of celebrities, but I have to say the one guy that really left a mark on me was John Candy. I produced and directed his cartoon show, Camp Candy, and I wish it had been a better show, but quite honestly, my experiences, I've worked with enough, you know, name performers that it's not really a big deal to me. But John was like a remarkably kind person, and uh, when I meet people from Canada, they're still very proud of him. And I always tell them, I said, "Well, I knew him. You have every right to be proud."
Absolutely. Oh, I loved his films, and
Yeah.
yeah, the laughter he brought to the world's definitively, always going to leave that mark. So,
Yep. Yep. No, I actually found out I got that job because I was a heavy set guy, and they thought that he would be more comfortable with somebody that he was working with was, not doing fat jokes and stuff all the time. And it actually turned out that was the case. We got along great.
yeah. Oh, that's so awesome to hear. I always like to hear about, the celebrities that you look up to and then hearing that they were actually so kind and so generous. And like it's always a nice affirmation when it's someone that you've always thought highly of and then you get confirmation it's awesome.
Yeah, it really is. And then every time you see him on film, even when he's gone, you kind of laugh because you see the real person underneath in the performance, and that makes it a whole different thing.
Absolutely. And you,
Yeah.
I read, pretty much have been into comics and cartoons and things since you were like, I guess you started reading comics around 3.
Yeah, I taught myself how to read before I was in kindergarten, reading mostly Uncle Scrooge, Donald Duck, Dennis the Menace, Fox and Crow, Woody Woodpecker, Mighty Mouse. So those are the kind of comics my parents would buy me. Those were the days when comic books were reputed to cause juvenile delinquency. There was actually a best-selling book that turned out to be all false research 50 years later, but there were actually comic book burnings when I was a little kid. So one time I asked my mom, I said, "Were you trying to turn me into a juvenile delinquent?" She says, "No, you just really seem to need them." And I definitely did need them because that's how I taught myself how to draw too,
Really? So just from like
copying the stuff I saw.
because you saw it and you got inspired and you just enjoyed it.
I think with cartoonists, there's something in our DNA. There's not enough of us around to merit the expense of any kind of scientific study, but I would say 90% of the cartoonists I know knew that's what they wanted to do from the time they were like little kids.
Wow. And I've read your blog and tried to kind of do a good amount of research. You definitely like to use that term cartoonist versus artist. Can you, for our listeners who don't know better, kind of define why that's such an important difference?
Well, everybody uses the term differently, but with deep within the cartooning community, especially the guys that do the comic strips, a cartoonist really means somebody that just doesn't draw, they write as well. They write, they think funny and draw however. Or for that matter, they don't have to think funny. I mean, a guy like Frank Miller, he's as dark as they come. He
Yes.
writes Batman and draws
Sin
Batman, and
City
he's a
and
definite cartoonist too. It kind of means a creator like Stan Sakai. Stan's
yes.
the perfect example. Stan does it all. He even letters it himself. So I mean, he's a cartoonist. He turns a blank page into a complete story, and I do the same thing, but I'm no Stan Sakai.
Oh, and he would argue with you right now, and I'll leave it to you guys to
Yeah,
battle
well,
that out. But he definitely has created this world of Usagi Yojimbo for sure.
oh
It's
yeah,
I'm a huge fan.
oh yeah. I mean, there's a tone to Stan stuff that's then mistakable. Stan and I just did a little project together that I don't think I can talk about it, but sooner or later you'll see it you'll see it in the newspapers, not in comic books. We did a little thing that'll run in the funnies.
Right, just
So
like the old school. Like I used to read Garfield, which I know you had to play into. I mean, I used to read.
yeah, yeah,
That's the
yeah,
only part of
yeah,
the
yeah.
paper I was ever interested in.
We did a guest starring thing in somebody else's comic strip. So at some point soon you'll hear about
Oh,
that.
I can't wait! I can't wait. That's
It was
very
fun.
exciting.
It was fun to work with Stan. We haven't worked together in a while, so that was cool.
Yeah, I can't wait. We are really looking forward to that. So, in terms of, we were talking earlier offline about animation, and because it's all crossing over now, and you and I have kind of a degree of separation where you worked on Mulan too, and you know a lot of the artists from that and everything, and of course I was fortunate to work on the first film Mulan, and so you kind of made a comment about that traditional animation and how you thought that was like one of the better ones or one of the last standing better ones or something. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that and of course your take on how animation has evolved.
Well, they're in the last days of traditional animation at Disney. I mean, we had some tremendous. I mean, well, I guess Little Mermaid was the beginning of the renewed classic era. But there, toward the end, it seemed like they were. I mean, I've worked at Disney, but I couldn't even possibly give you any kind of an analysis of how management was thinking, other than I always got the impression they were kind of chasing their tail, especially with all those sequels. Um, Happily Ever After seemed to never not mean much anymore, and I don't think. I don't think any of those stories necessarily needed to be told, but I think Mulan was a real strong story, and kind of ahead of its, well, maybe not, it shouldn't have been ahead of its time because things should have been straightened out a long time ago. But you look at it now and it feels very progressive, realizing that it was 20 years ago or so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
And
it was one of the first Disney princesses. They always say like, "Oh, she didn't get rescued. She rescued everyone else," whereas all the others
yeah,
were more of
yeah,
a damsel in distress situation, right?
sure, sure. And I mean, even the villain looked like he was out of one of those old Hanna-Barbera cartoons. He looked like a real like supervillain kind of
Yes.
character. It was a real scary design, which you don't see in many princess movies. It's usually another woman that's the bad guy in most of those. But anyway, that was a strong one. Lilo and Stitch is one of my favorite Disney movies ever. I think that's great because it really does have that island spirit. And uh, I know Chris Sanders, the creator. We worked together on Muppet Babies, and I used to hear him doing the voice of Stitch back when we were working on the show the first season, like in '83, something like that. So he was already working out that character even then.
Wow. Okay.
And I think that's, you know he was so invested in that movie. It's one of the few Disney movies that has an actual point of view of one individual, as far as I can see. Most of that stuff is a real, committee project, but he undertook so much of the creation of it that it still bears kind of his personal vibe, which is cool. Not just his voice, but his outlook. I like the Tarzan movie a lot because I'm a Tarzan fan. Although it's amazing they can have an entire movie set in Africa and not one black person in the entire film. That it was like, yeah, that's taking a real stand, Disney. It's like an alternate universe, Africa up
Yeah,
there.
yeah, the fantasy part of it was heavy, very strong there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was. I don't know. Again, they didn't seem to know exactly where they were on that. I actually, it's one of the few times I actually liked Phil Collins' music, but it was like a pretty dark movie, and Tarzan's a pretty dark story, but then they'd have like all these happy gorillas doing a dance, and it was like, well, that's kind of distracting us from the seriousness of the story here. But in general, I liked it. I The Incredibles is one of my favorite cartoons ever.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
I
that's
mean
going
that was
into the modern era. So, I have
yeah.
a curiosity about that because as I was, able to talk to Stan and, I'm just amazed. Like he's literally putting, ink to pen, I'm sorry, ink to paper. And it's, such a traditional way. And of course, now you see, I don't even know what it's like when people go to art school. Are they still drawing? Are they still doing things by hand? Or is it mostly, computer based knowledge that they're trying to get? Because that's kind of what's been very popular with once it went into CGI, computer animation. So I was wondering what you felt was, is traditional animation, is that has that skill gone by the wayside, or is there still definitely kind of a place for it in this kind of more modern era of film?
Well, I mean, it's certainly still out there, and I mean that's what people actually like to do. I got to tell you, I mean, I don't know that many animators nowadays, but everybody I know prefers still. I mean, yeah, they'll work digitally, but they love getting that pencil, hitting the paper. They love that drag. They love the idea of using an eraser. There's just something more organic about it. But obviously, they're going to do whatever they have to keep working. I uh, I regret that I'm not more savvy technologically, but fortunately, I've been so busy I can't afford to take the time out to suddenly learn a whole new process where I'm trying to work as fast as I can just to get the stuff done that I've got already got assignments on. But I think that well, I'd mentioned Floyd Norman. He has told me many times that even though there's some outstanding animation that is done by the computer, that he considers it essentially like puppeteering more than animating.
Okay.
Is that you've got an object and you're distorting it and moving it around, but you're essentially doing it with invisible strings like a puppeteer, as opposed to actually having to think out every drawing to the point where you're recreating it each time rather than just adjusting a digital image. And that makes sense to me. I think, I mean, every drawing, it's like every performance you do. You aren't just like, oh, yeah, well, I'll just, there's a setting I go to and then I just adjust my tone. It's like you have to create it from
Yeah,
scratch. And
absolutely.
it's the same way. It's like when I'm drawing something, I'm thinking, okay, that's the elbow, that's the elbow. Now, okay, that's the hand, that's the hand. I mean, it's like you're kind of becoming part of it, whether you want to or not. There's no automatic drawing. And when you're doing the other, it seems like something's doing the heavy lifting for you. And I don't know, maybe it's certainly easier, and it's certainly more labor smart for the people with the money.
Right.
But frankly, I think there have been so many bad CG movies over the years. You would think that some smart studio would say, we're going to blow everybody's mind with a really great classic animated movie that feels really modern. I think, unfortunately, going back to reviewing the movies, the last shot that Disney had was the Frog Princess, or the Princess and the Frog. I
Yeah.
forget.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was the name. And it was like there was too much expectation on it. It was too packed with stuff. It was like, yeah, this is enough to make three movies out of. And
Right.
I felt bad because it didn't feel like anything in that movie had enough room to breathe. Because it was like the last big show to try, maybe if we make this really good, we'll get another chance. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, no, the management had already decided, that was the last one. But the day will come where it's like, hey, this stuff is also bland and the same. We need something to wake people up. We're going to do it the old way.
Yeah.
That'll happen inevitably.
I think so
You know,
too.
the computer is just a tool.
Yeah, I agree. I've actually been waiting for it as well. I'm like, you know how it's like vintage clothes come back around, or like what is old is now new. So I feel like the same for the animation. It's like, especially because a lot of people who still watch animation have that nostalgia of watching The Little Mermaid or Mulan, or in that era. And I think there would be a really nice draw for that generation, but also to introduce the younger generation, not just to like Disney classics and Warner Brother classics and things like that, but also so that they could see like there are more than one way, to have art and to create and to tell a story. And so I'm waiting for it as well. So maybe you're gonna start working on something like that, and you can bring that about.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've never worked on any theatrical stuff. I've done lots of TV
Hmm.
shows and lots of made for video and hundreds of commercials, but no movies yet.
Yet.
But you never know.
You never know. You
Yeah,
never know.
yeah.
When you were talking earlier about the actual process of drawing, and you said something about like that drag on the paper on the palette, right? Like that really spoke to me because for me, I'm very a physical artist, right? So everything I do is very physical, and so I told Stan Sakai the same. I'm like, I can't even draw a stick figure. My drawing ability is nil. So I always find it fascinating when I watch you guys do interviews or talk at comic cons, or and you're drawing while explaining or talking, and it's almost like the hand has a mind of its own. Do you kind of feel like it's just kind of this like thing from from the Addams Family, like it just does its own thing? Or but then you explain this great connection where you're constantly thinking, oh, this is the elbow, this is the elbow. So I mean, how connected are you when you're drawing something? Maybe it's a matter of the familiarity of the subject too, right? Because Stan can draw Usagi with his eyes closed, backwards, upside down. But maybe if you're trying to draw something different, there's more that you have to think about. How does that work?
Well, I've actually drawn Flintstone with my eyes closed,
I believe that.
in front of like a crowd of 2,000 people. So I've got evidence. But it's for me, it's the most interesting part of my job, whether it's doing an illustration or a comic story or a children's book, whatever, is figuring it out, working it out. That's when I've got to really be thinking and okay, what's the story? What do the characters look like? How do I get this thing working around? Once I have everything built and all I have to do is polish it up, that's when I can kind of be in more of an alpha state and just be, kind of in that world, but at the same time, I'm able to talk on the phone or, have a conversation. But especially if I'm writing dialogue, I've, I've got to be, usually I've worked out my daily schedule. So I do I work, the inking or the type pencil work in the mornings, and of course the interviews too. Um, and then in the afternoon, I usually am on the phone making business calls or you know, kind of juggling things. And the late night, that's when I like to do the thinking work and just especially the writing stuff and get as crazy as I want. And that's another thing that I do in the morning is the editing, the thinking work. Okay, that makes no sense at all. Just get rid of that. But but I mean at every point there's a different kind of having to be present, but you have to kind of, at least when I'm not working on somebody else's specifications, I love the fact that you can change things at the last minute if you think you can make it funnier. And in my case, that's most of the stuff I do is funny stuff. Stan's stuff is, even though it's in a cartoony style, is extremely dramatic. Once in a while, he'll do a funny story,
Yes.
but it's not that often anymore. He used to have a character called Nilson Groundthumper, who was kind of his comic relief character, where if he wanted to do a funny story. But now he's so often in the world of Usagi, it's just more of a world of ethics and morals
Oh
and
yes.
blood and all that.
Yes,
Yeah. Very.
I, it is very
It
dramatic.
surprises me that it surprises me he doesn't have a bigger following in Japan, considering how traditionally Japanese his stories are.
I agree. I told him I've learned so much about Japanese culture and tradition. And as a Chinese American, I was like, I wish there was someone like Stan Sakai for my culture so I could learn more about my culture through something amazing storytelling like Usagi, because he does so much research and puts so much detail into those stories and you know, everything from the architecture to the games they're playing on the street to the food. It's just so authentic. But you're right, it is not. There are some cute parts where we'll have like some of the fun characters, but it is pretty dramatic. I mean, some of his issues make me cry. They're so dramatic. They're
Sure,
pretty
sure. Well,
intense.
that's why he's so good. Yeah, yeah. By the way, you might want to check out. There's a fellow named Gene Yang whose work you might want to look at.
Oh, okay.
Cartoonist. Yeah. It's not historical, but it's very much about the Chinese American experience. So you might dig it.
Thank you. I'm actually going to start picking your
Yes.
brain for more recommendations. But on the flip side, I do need comedy in my life because I can't just be crying every time I read it. I'm saying, oh, I'm reading comics right now, but I'm literally like sad. So on the flip side,
Yeah.
there is that yin to the yang, and we do need that. So I always appreciate, like I've seen your long list of things that you work on, and like you said, you like funny. So what are kind of the funny things you like to read now, or what kind of keeps you entertained?
Well, I let me see. Of course, Sergio Aragone's work is always great, and he's another good friend. But I mean, he was one of my heroes when I met him back at Comic Con in 1971, I think, or 72. In 72, I've known him since 72, and so his Grew the Wanderer and his stuff in Mad Magazine. That's top of the line for American comics, in my opinion. Funny stuff, good storytelling, good insight, everything. It's all the marks. Um, my favorite funny comic is probably an underground comic called The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. Uh,
Okay, I've never
about
heard of it.
they're about it's essentially what kind of the Marx Brothers is hippies, and
Okay.
all of their stunts are just how can they get more drugs. And it's like the fellow that created him just did a new issue, but I mean he's like in his late 70s. I doubt if he's going to be chasing too many more stories around, but I mean they're more applicable now than they were back when they were created in the late 60s. I
Right.
mean, I've seen people that could be my grandchildren reading them and laughing them. But the funny thing is about them is that they were written intentionally. So if you were a policeman, you'd find them just as funny because these hippies are idiots. But so are the cops. Everybody's an idiot.
Right, right. I think
So
it's
they are genuinely funny. Yeah.
yeah. I think it's always the best though when things can stand that test of time. Like it's funny then, it's funny now, it's funny in the future. Like that's when something's like really like hit it right. When it kind of
Yeah,
just it's evergreen.
this cartoonist also had a character called Wonder Warthog, who was a
He likes
superhero who was just
alliteration,
a
this one.
he was just a yeah he does he knows it's funny. It was just a giant warthog pig dressed in a superhero suit flying around town. So that got my attention. We went back when I was in junior high. I was starting to see his work, and that was a big influence on me.
I saw that you always say that the Fantastic Four number 29 has been your favorite superhero comic pretty much of all time, and that like that still upholds for you. Is it because it's nostalgia, or do you just feel like it's just the best?
Number 29.
That's yeah, that
That's
on your
my
blog.
favorite.
That on your blog you
Oh,
wrote.
I didn't know that.
You wrote the Jack Kirby Stan
Well,
Lee has remained your favorite superhero comic book since, but maybe
the
that's changed.
Fantastic Four, that period of the Fantastic Four, I'd say number 35 actually. But
Oh,
there you
okay.
go. things change. Uh, um, I love the Fantastic Four because it's, first of all, it's fun. It's not, even if it's the end of the world, you've got the Thing wisecracking over on the side about, making some sort of kind of, you know, Brooklyn comment about the situation. It's essentially the Fantastic Four is essentially the inspiration for the Incredibles because it's about a family of superheroes, and Jack Kirby was drawing it and pretty much writing it in terms of the storylines, and they're not they're superheroes, but they're also adventurers. So there are a lot of interesting ideas in it. And that was the period where they kind of, Stanley and Jack Kirby had kind of figured out how to make it work. And I remember when that was coming out, the only time I can ever remember, like literally counting the days before the next issue. I was so into, like, I can't wait to see what they've come up with next. And I wound up knowing both men. Stan Sakai worked with Stan Lee, and I worked with Stan Lee at Marvel Productions, and we both knew Jack Kirby quite well. So, I mean, we're both pretty lucky in knowing those guys.
Absolutely. And actually, speaking of Stan Lee, the great Stan Lee, he gave this really great quote about your collection of oddball comics, which is again something that just shows your sense of humor. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, as a kid, I collected a lot of comics, and one of the things I liked collecting in comics was comics with a gorilla or a dinosaur on the cover because I like gorillas and dinosaurs. I still do. And 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 after a while, I realized, boy, I've got a lot of these things. And I liked other kinds of comics too, but if I saw one and had an extra dime, that was one. Whether it was a comic I read normally or not, I'd pick it up. So years later, I'm working in a comic book store, and I'm realizing there's other people that have these specialties too. I'd meet people that collected comics with cameras on the cover. There was a red-haired singer that used to sing with that band, the Manhattan Express, or no, Manhattan Transfer, and she was a redhead. She only collected comics with redheads on the cover, and I realized a lot of people like comics not for the normal reasons. And then at the same time, because I was becoming a professional cartoonist and kind of having to be more analytical about what I drew, I became more analytical about looking at other people's work as well. And suddenly I'm looking at comic book covers in a whole different way because those were the sales tool to get kids, to buy them in the first place, was what was on the cover, really. And suddenly I'm seeing weird sexual images and things that make no sense and just the dopiest characters. And I realized these are the kind of comics that most of them were comics I was reading anyway. So they were a big influence on me because I like to put things that don't really belong together in comics. That's kind of my sense of humor. But the more I've collected on this stuff, the more I realize, and I'm going through them now, I've got thousands of comics that you're like, how did this even get published? And I've been doing this as a slideshow since the early 70s at Comic Con. And next year, I'm having a big 200-page book being published about my collection of oddball comics with my wisecrack comments on accompanying each one.
Well, we look forward to that.
Yeah, and I'll be doing a new version at Comic Con this year too. So I've been isolating some things that I'd forgotten I had that are make your eyebrows fall off. So.
I cannot wait to see it. I'm gonna have to make sure I write that down to catch that panel. And so, what would you give? This is my first San Diego Comic Con, and I'm a little terrified. And I could see that it has grown into this beast of a convention. And I love to see, I watch all the Marvel films, etc. But I really am excited more to like hear you and Stan Sakai speak, and I'm excited to see a lot of those special guests that I've seen on the panels. But what would you recommend someone like me who it's like their first time at Comic Con? What should I do?
I'd suggest that you enjoy the dealer's room on Wednesday night when it's not too crazy, and spend most of the convention going to see creators speak about how they think and why they create, and try to avoid things that are trying to sell you the next big blockbuster or the next big comic or the next big video game, because unfortunately, like I said, marketing, uh, if you aren't if you just kind of wander that dealer's room, you're going to burn out, and you're going to be you'll feel like an extra in a remake of Day of the Locust, because those crowds get crazy at times. They really do.
I'm a little afraid.
So I will tell you though, and this is not self promotion, because it's really about the whole event. But my favorite thing to do at Comic Con, and one of the most popular events at Comic Con, is something that I'm involved with, is a thing called Quick Draw. And Quick Draw involves Sergio Aragonis, myself as cartoonists, Mark Evanier, a writer and a guy we both worked with, and he's kind of like the game show host. And then we'll have a third cartoonist every year. I don't know who it'll be this year. Last year it was Lalo Alcaraz, who's an editorial cartoonist. But he throws out challenges, and we have overhead projectors, and we each try to draw the funniest gag as fast as we possibly can. So you're actually seeing live how cartoonists think and what we come up with. And it's not really a contest, because we're actually working against ourselves. I mean, trying to be funny in front of 2,000 people is a bit of a challenge in and of itself, because you kind of have to just block it out and just be in the zone.
Mm-hmm.
But Sergio is the main course. I'm kind of the parsley off on the side of the plate. You know, he's like a superhero of cartoonists. You know, he's truly one of the best cartoonists in the world.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
think I think the cartooning community would agree on that. But the idea of just watching us kind of performing like trained seals, but it's essentially like doing improv. It's unlike anything done anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely looking
So
forward to it.
that's the thing I think that you would enjoy, and it like you, it's truly creative. It's not just saying, "Hey, buy this, please."
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm definitely looking forward to that. It sounds incredible. I did see some clips of you guys doing that, and like I said, I just have such a high regard for being able to create, but then be able to it like on the spot and under time constraints and with the pressure. That it's a lot of fun though, and obviously, like you all as the cartoonists have like a really good time with it, and you all don't take yourselves too seriously.
We never take ourselves serious. If we do, we're out of a job. But I mentioned Mark Evanier. Usually that same day, he also does a whole a voiceover panel, where and you might want to talk to Mr. Evanier sometime, because he has a number of different people with a number of different backgrounds, and they're all given the same script, and everybody can interpret it. They do a table read,
Yeah.
and it's like everybody's, somebody say, I'll do this as a Russian spy, and I'll do
Yes.
this as a gay surfer or whatever. And it's like it's like suddenly, and maybe it'll be something like an old Jay Ward cartoon, so suddenly you get a whole new take on it, and it's great.
Oh, that's see, this is what I need now. My listeners are going, all right, Mimi, stop being so selfish. Like this is just all about you. But also, I mean, people out there are going to Comic Con. If you are lucky enough to get a ticket, you might be going. And if you're lucky enough to survive the hotel apocalypse, you may be going to stay there. And so I think people want to hear from esteemed guests like yourselves who, have a take of seeing it evolve over these last 50 years and really kind of at the heart of what it's about for you all who kind of really started it. I think that's something that's really important. So this isn't just selfish me asking for myself, but I think everybody also wants to know kind of what you would go to see when you're wandering around all those thousands and thousands of people. But I will admit I am very intimidated about the whole experience. So
Well, in my case, the thing I like to go see are cartoonists actually older than myself. uh, that's kind of like seeing Sasquatch now. But But there are out there, and it is great to just connect with other cartoonists that I've never met before.
Hmm.
Young guys, old guys, young women. It has nothing to do with, we're kind of our own minority in a weird way, because there we're not a minority. But out in the regular world, you don't run into cartoonists very often, and if you do, it's unusual because we're usually locked at our drawing table, so we can't get out of the house anyway. But
You're under cartooning house arrest. You have a project and you have to finish it. How long does it normally take for you to do a project?
it just depends on what it is. I just, for example, I just did a project that went quite quickly, and it's an unusual thing. Well, I do all kinds of strange things. I designed a character that will be going on the wrapper of millions of ice cream sandwiches sold in Korea.
Oh.
So there you go.
That
and
is a
I
very specific
and I
niche.
yes, and I did that. I did that in a day. So that, but I had to think it out. But at my level of experience, I kind of tend to kind of know what I'm going to do, the first time out. I don't have to play around with it too much. So that kind of came from working in advertising for many years. You don't have a whole lot of time. You got to go with your best hunch.
Right, absolutely. Oh my goodness. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm sure you have some drawing and thinking and creating and whatnot to do. So I
Oh,
really appreciate you.
I've got one right here. Here you go. See, I have been working on what we're talking, but
I
this is
love it.
waiting
I
for
love
me
the multitasking.
to finish
See,
it. Yeah.
it's brilliant. It's brilliant. No, it's been amazing to get to know you, but also to kind of hear what you're thinking while you're creating and that whole process. I find it really fascinating. I do hope we get a chance to talk more in the future, about whatever you're working on next. And also, is there anything that you want our listeners to check out? I do urge everybody to check out your website, which is shawcartoons.com, and I'll link that here. But
Oh,
you're
great.
you're always up to the next new and crazy thing.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I've got Oddball Comics coming out next year. I've got a new. Oh, here, let me show you this. I've got a new kids book that
Oh,
I've illustrated, and I'm doing the sequel now. But this is available on Amazon. It's called. Let me see. Of course, the sun is coming
Marooned
into the room. You probably
Lagoon.
got a glare on it like crazy. Marooned Lagoon, and these are the characters that I've created, and you can
There's a
see
bus
that.
in
So
a
that's
tree.
available. Yeah, yes. Yeah, well, it's a post hurricane
Oh,
fun story. Yes,
all right. Well,
having
being from
we're
Florida,
having
I
fun
I can
having
I can
fun
relate
with
to that.
disasters. Yeah, that's right. Well, it takes place in the Everglades.
Okay, well, yeah, that's not too
Yeah,
far from
yeah.
me. I'm in
That's
Orlando, so
yeah, exactly. Well, I hope you have a fun time the next time a horrible horrible storm hits.
well, we're always fortunate here in Central Florida, but yes, it's always good to have a fun outlook on everything in life, disasters or not, right?
Yeah.
So I am excited to meet you at San Diego Comic Con. I know you're going to be super busy, but I'll definitely come stalk you down, go and cheer for you, and say that you're not parsley at the quick draw, and I'll be cheering your cheering section. But it's been really awesome to get to know you and hear all the cool things that you've been working on, but also just to get all the history of the cartooning, and it's been quite a pleasure, Scott Shaw. So
Well,
thank you
thank you
so
very
much.
much, Mimi. I'm really, really glad we can do this. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in July.
Absolutely.
All right, take care.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or follow me on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.